All right. So, this presentation is about just making sure that you understand Shakespeare, who Shakespeare is, and just the general time period that he was um, performing in. So, if you need to go double speed with this, go for it. You don't have to listen to my normal voice. Uh, so this is Shakespeare, him and his sexy bald head. And look at him. He's so dashing and daring with his earring. He's so sexy. Why are we reading William Shakespeare? Really, that is like a really common question because he's one of the most read playwrights literally of all time, across the world. He is the most performed playwright of all time, again, performed across the world. This isn't just in America. This isn't just in Europe. I'm talking about African representations of this, Eastern Europe, or not Eastern Europe, but Eastern representations. China performs these plays. And so, like, it's just important for us to know who this dude is because he's everywhere. Okay. Um, What's also super weird about it is that we know almost nothing about this dude. Like, church and legal documents are all that we know about Shakespeare's life because that's the only thing that really kept records. The only other thing that we know about him is through hearsay of people's journals or reviews of his plays. But so we know he existed, but a lot of the other stuff is kind of pieced together. It's almost like an investigative kind of like trying to figure out a mystery. So, like, we know he when he was born and we know when he died. And the only reason we know when he was born is because the churches of the time had baptismal records. So he was born, and the reason I won't get into that. But so when he was born, the church immediately baptized him, and they have that in their records. So April 23rd, 1564, that is when he was born in Stratford upon Avon. So again, that's all we know about him in the immediate. We also know that it's assumed that he went to grammar school. General ideas or general representations of him being in school, but he didn't, like, that'd be like going to elementary school and then he dropped out. And I guess dropped out isn't the right word. It's more of like he wasn't a rich person, so he couldn't continue his education. He had basic education, and then that's it. The reason that this is so peculiar and something to keep note of is that, like, could you imagine going up into fifth grade, dropping out of school, but then being the most performed playwright of anyone's lifetime? That seems insane. Um, so he had a fifth grade education, but his plays represent that he had a much stronger education than that. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of discrepancy, or not, well, yes, discrepancy, but arguing about, like, who was this guy? Was William Shakespeare the actual playwright who wrote these? Because the William Shakespeare that we know went to school for a couple years, and that's it. And so there's a little bit of a question concerning that, that there's no way this dude right here wrote those plays. Maybe someone else wrote them and he put his name on it, or they let him put his name on it, any number of things. We also know for a fact that William Shakespeare married a woman named Anne Hathaway. And no, I'm not talking about the Anne Hathaway in the movies. This is Anne Hathaway. I don't know, somebody who lived in Stratford. He married her when he was 18 and she was 26. This is interesting. And church records show that a couple months after they were married, they had a baby. So there's some questions about, like, did they get married? What was the reason they got married? So could it be because she was going to have his baby? Maybe. Anyways, so we know that he got married to Anne Hathaway. We also know, based on other people's journals about being watching plays, that he moved to London in order to make money. Like, he was an actor when he moved to London, and then he moved up and became a playwright, etc., etc. Didn't bring his money behind, or excuse me, didn't bring his family with him. Instead, it's believed that he sent the family money. He ended up living most of the rest of his life in London, rarely coming back to see his to see his family. His death certificate says that he died on April 23rd, 1616, which seems kind of weird because that's when he was born. It was April 23rd. So there's some question about, like, if that's the actual day he died. He probably died in 1616, but they don't know the exact date, so they just put his birth date. But regardless, whatever. Let's just pretend he did die on his birthday. So, yay, Shakespeare! Look at you. You fun. Shakespeare wrote in a time referred to as the Renaissance, and you may have gone through this a little bit in your um, world history class. So, the Renaissance, we're talking about the Renaissance in England, not the Renaissance in Italy, which happened earlier than when it happened in England. But this Renaissance was during the 1500s. That's when it really started to be fostered in England. That's when Shakespeare was writing. And this concept of the Renaissance was really fostered by Queen Elizabeth I, or the Virgin Queen. So like she reigned from 1558 to 1603, which is right in the midst of him writing his stuff. So he and other playwrights and other writers at the time were definitely influenced by her, and her involvement and her desire to continue this idea throughout literature, throughout art, pretty much throughout society, that she wanted to really foster the Renaissance. So the importance of the Renaissance is like this big emphasis on science, commerce, and business, philosophy, the arts. Like before, what happened, or like before the Renaissance, there was a lot of heavy religious, I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it, indoctrination, where it was kind of like God is the end all be all, he decides everything. So there really wasn't a whole lot of further discussion or further look at this. Further information concerning life. It was just like, that's God, right? So that's what it was expected to be, or not expected to be, but that's what people relied on. But with the Renaissance, what they did is now science and a greater understanding of humans started to become, I don't want to say in vogue, but people started to look closer at their understanding of the world. And that's why I have this picture over here, because this is one of Leonardo da Vinci's representations in his journals of the human body. And I know Da Vinci was Italian, shut up, don't care, but he was like one of the fathers of the Renaissance. So this understanding of the human body in science and medicine was definitely a huge driver in the Renaissance. Then this artistic interpretation here is actually a like doctors learning about the human body. You'll notice that they've got the corpse is, they're looking at the tendons and the muscles of the body. And so like this is a perfect representation of the concept of the Renaissance in the sciences, because all these doctors are looking in there. And I'm sure you've seen this, like the meme where this guy is like, I showed up for a birthday party and it ended up being a cult. Like that's you see this picture as a meme, but what this picture actually represents is the concept of the Renaissance. So like this greater understanding of the world and of life, and it's not that they stopped being Christian, but their idea of God changed. That where he was no longer the God, the deity, was no longer the only influence in how life went. That it used to be like God had determined your life and how it would go. Now the Renaissance opened up this like, I am an individual, I have a freedom of choice, and so like I have control over my own fate and my own destiny. So it's not that they abandoned religion, but their concept of religion definitely was in flux, or their Christian religion was in flux due to the era of the Renaissance. Now, this lady, this is Queen Elizabeth I. That's what I referenced earlier, the Virgin Queen. She was and continues to be seen as a major monarch in the English history. So Queen Elizabeth was a strong one and a strong monarch, and definitely during times that were problematic. So one of the big things that she is credited for is warding off Spain during their Spain trying to invade England. Spain thought it was theirs. We have rights to this land, blah, 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 whatever. So Queen Elizabeth took and put all of the English troops together, not put them together, but she like gathered all the English troops, and they waited for the Spanish Armada. And if that rings a bell, it probably should, because around this time period, the Spanish Armada, which is their Spanish fleet, the fleet of like ships and stuff, was one of the strongest in the Western world. And so here's this Queen Elizabeth who, is like this weak and frail. She's this woman with this frail mind and she just can't do anything. She gets up and she brings all of her troops and just waits for their armada. And it was considered pretty stupid because, I mean, there's no way it was basically a death sentence. But what happened is when Spain was coming over, there was tumultuous winds and rain and a huge storm and crashed the entire armada. Like most of the armada was depleted because of that. And so imagine this: they credit Queen Elizabeth and God shining down on her, and saying like she's strong. So they credit her with a lot of that success, and her, not just her, but it was like God that influenced that. But again, notice how that's kind of in contrast to what they were saying here. Like God doesn't play a role in this. We have freedom of choice, but clearly she's got God's favor because he intervened here. She also quelled a lot of the fighting between the the Protestants and the Catholics. You might know about Martin Luther and his nailing of the theses on the Catholic doors. Blah blah blah. There's lots of protests. Like in England, they be fighting. And they be fighting hardcore, like fighty, stabby. This is some pretty mortal disputes that they were getting into, and so she took over. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but she took over and basically said, "Knock it off." And while they didn't stop completely, she definitely was credited to making sure that both sides were happy. Um, they appreciated her strong leadership, and England was prospering during this time. And again, they're going to look to their leader to as the reason to why it is prosperous. You also see this through plays that were written. They will reference Queen Elizabeth, poetry that was written in adulation of Queen Elizabeth, stories that were written during the Renaissance, all that a lot of people, excuse me, a lot of people, playwrights, artists, everything were influenced by Queen Elizabeth. Also, fun fact, this little guy, that's an ermine. He's a little rat, but kind of a rat. If you notice, I'm sure you've seen this coat before, this white with black flecks. That's actually a sign of aristocracy. So you probably have seen like kings with like purple robes. Is a royal color, but then they have like a trim of this white fur with black specks. Definitely showing royalty there. That's a royalty thing. And notice how the ermine is actually wearing a crown. So that visual here is definitely representation of how incredible she is. And she's just lavished with jewels. Oh my goodness, just incredible. Look at her. She crazy good. Um, so it was also her belief that she had to foster a strong English culture. And in doing so, what she did is she supported the arts. So she commissioned artists, she supported playwrights and authors. Like when I say supported, I mean like financially she supported them or publicly announced her support for them. And because of that, other wealthy citizens did as well. I mean, it's like whatever the queen does, that's the trend. Gots to do it. So she did that, and therefore other wealthy citizens did as well. And the flourish of English culture is considered the Elizabethan era. So there's a lot of crossover between the Renaissance and the Elizabethan era because she supported the work that was happening during the Renaissance. Playwrights, poets, artists, authors, musicians, most of them were held in high esteem. And this is definitely around the time that Shakespeare was performing with the Lord Chamberlain's men, and he was oftentimes performing in front of rich and in front of the monarchy. So, also to keep in mind when we talk about Shakespeare, we need to consider where he was performing. And so he performed in private stages, like I said in the previous slide, that performing for the rich and for monarchy. So they're not performing on a stage, but he also did do that. So performing for the theater in London. So to keep in mind that during the Renaissance, the theater was like a place where everybody would go. That's their entertainment. They definitely didn't have a Nintendo DS. They did not have Xbox. They did not have PlayStation. They didn't have a cell phone. They didn't have any of that stuff. I mean, like, what was their favorite game? A hoop and a stick? Throwing rocks at a cow? I don't know. Like, or they were constantly working because well, that's the upper class. The upper class would like read books and do all that stuff, but the lower class, they were literally working to stay alive. And so the theater was the one place that they could get a respite from all of this work. And so like you would go to the theater and you would see upperclassmen, not upperclassmen, but upper class, wealthy people and lower class impoverished paupers going to the plays. Okay. So um, they wanted to see these productions, and both the rich and the poor had access to them. Okay, that the storylines. What's interesting is that like Shakespeare and other playwrights totally knew who they were performing for and writing for. So their plays have elements that are there for the rich and elements for the not so rich, right? So like the rich people and the educated, those are the ones that are going to give them the money, and so they got to put stuff in there that they like. So they got to put storylines that they would be aware of or history in the play. And they would write with beautiful prose and verse, and so like they would try to attract the rich and educated, but the working class also liked a lot of the action. They liked a lot of the fun stuff. They liked, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. I am so surprised that everybody loves Shakespeare in education because he's super inappropriate. There are so many sex jokes, fart jokes, disgusting poop jokes all over his stories. But like he put those in there because the people that would be going, like they're the lower class, they don't have access to education. They're there for the fight scenes and the fart jokes and the inappropriate sex jokes. That's why they're there. So um, and Shakespeare knew this, and so he crafted his plays to appeal to both of them. And this is like going to the theater was like going to like a sporting event. They became involved in the play. They would cry, they would boo, they would throw stuff on the stage. Like they got involved in it. Incredibly unlike going to a play today or even at a movie theater. I mean, seriously, if I go to a movie theater and I hear people whispering, I basically go into a murderous rage. But here, like people would be talking, people would be like cheering and jeering, they'd be openly weeping. Um, this is definitely different, but again, it's because this is their only form of entertainment. And so they're going there because this is their outlet. Uh, the most famous place that Shakespeare performed was in the Globe Theater. This is an open air theater, and most of the theaters were open air because they didn't have any lights. Like they didn't have electricity, so they performed their plays during the day, so the light could come in and so everybody could see the stage. So it's 3 stories high, which is pretty big, and the actors performed on a raised stage. And I'll show you more pictures of this, but it's like right in the middle, and then the seats were all around the circle there, right? Not back here. Well, I'll show you a little bit about that later, but like all of the stage here, and then there would be people that would be on the floor. Okay. It could hold up to about 3,000 spectators, and the cheapest seats were on the ground. That's down here. And again, I'll show you some of that. And that wasn't a place to sit. You had to stand up, and they packed them in there like sardines because the more people you get in there, more money you make. We oftentimes refer to those people as groundlings, but when I went to the Globe Theater, and my husband and I went to England like 7 years ago, they explained that a lot of the actors referred to them as penny stinkards. So in their journals, the actors would call them penny stinkards because they paid a penny to get in, and guess what? They stank. They didn't shower very much, if at all. And so, like, the actors talked about how terrible it was to perform for them because they stink real bad. And the more money you had, the better seats you had. So here are some examples of the Globe Theater. So the Globe Theater burnt down because during Shakespeare's lifetime, actually, because they used torches and a cannon went off and it burnt the whole thing down because, hey, guess what? They didn't have concrete back then. It was all hay, mud, and sticks. Or not sticks, but wood. But so this is a modern representation that was built in the early 2000s. So like these were the cheaper seats. These were the more expensive seats. These were the more expensive seats. This was the more expensive seat. And the most expensive seat that you could get was way over here if the play wasn't utilizing this space. So for Romeo and Juliet, probably wouldn't use it because they have the famous balcony scene that they need to be up here. But like, if you think about it, you want to pay more money to be seen by everybody. So you're going to pay the money to be like, look at me, I'm at the play. And everybody can see you. But like I said, the more money you paid, the better seats you got. These are not luxurious seats. My husband and I sat about right here. Whoa, those benches suck butts. They are really uncomfortable. But again, back then, they were like, hey, whatever, I'm getting entertained. And so here's a picture of the stage that they would be on, and here's where the groundlings would be. More pictures of the stage and what, or the stage and the places that people would sit. Here is a closer look at those chairs that I told you that was uncomfortable. This they didn't have there. This man doesn't speak English, and I asked him to move so I could get a picture of the stage. And I think he thought that meant that he should pose. So he's posing for you all. And yeah, he's great. I took a picture of the costumes too because the costumes were incredibly important during the Shakespeare time. So this would be something that a royal person would wear, and if you look closely, like a royal person on stage would wear. Very lavish. They have pearls that were sewn into the dress, and so like this is definitely like if someone walked on stage with this on, they would know that this person is royal. And this is a picture that I could have gotten my camera taken away for. We weren't supposed to take pictures if actors were on stage, but haha, I got one. And they didn't steal my camera, which they totally did to other people. They stole other people's cameras. But so this is what it was like on stage. And notice how the stage is pretty barren. There's not a lot of there's almost no scenery on here. There's nothing. They've got some chairs hidden away and something over here to represent a bedroom. But that's pretty much it. And notice all these people that are packed in. Like, and when I was there, if somebody tried to sit down or they tried to lean up against the stage over here, they would be excused. They would be asked to leave. So they took this pretty seriously, and they said they're following the same rules that they understood the rules to be back then as well. And also, again, notice how their outfits, not all that fancy. And that tells us that the people on stage there were not important individuals to the play. Or, hold on, let me rephrase that. They were not rich. Now, because today we're kind of spoiled, because when we go to a movie, even when we go to a stage play, they have a lot of effects that they can use. They can use different lighting. They can use, I mean, like in a movie, they can literally use CGI to create anything. But if you think about 500 years ago, that's not a chance. So the audience had to rely a lot on imagination. So there were no curtains either to call the end of a scene. Like, look at there's no place for curtains. This is literally what it looked like. So there's no way that they couldn't put stuff backstage. There wasn't any scenery because where are they going to store it? There's nowhere to put it. They had some props. They had sound effects that they could create themselves. Incredible costumes, and dialogue was super important. So people oftentimes get frustrated with Shakespeare because he takes a long time to describe something. Like rather than saying, oh, I'm going to go out to breakfast now, implying that it's morning, he's got like 3 or 4 lines describing the morning sun and how it's coming out and how beautiful it is. And like, that's annoying. Why not just say sun? The sun is out. But the reason is because he needs to make sure it's clear to his audience that the sun is out. Because they can't dim the lights or make the lights brighter to show that. They had to use the language in order to convey that. And so again, I took some pictures of some of the costumes that were used. I don't know if they're actually used or if they're just replicas, but this is what you would expect to see on stage of someone who was rich. If they were representing somebody who is rich. And another thing that people don't sometimes acknowledge, and sometimes they do, but they don't understand, there were actually no females allowed on the stage. The reason for that is they thought that acting was considered like a formal art, and so women could not participate in it. So just like women couldn't be painters, women couldn't be poets, women couldn't write. The only thing women were allowed to do in terms of art was to write prayer books and cookbooks, and that's it. So women were not allowed on stage because they thought that they were incapable or they were inferior. Like they just couldn't do it. Acting was considered an important job. And there is research to show, like here's a a male individual dressed as a female. So they tried to do the best they could in finding males that represented females, the type of female character that they were trying to convey. And so in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet's rather young, and so they'd have to get a pretty young dude to represent a teenage girl. And they were highly paid because it was hard to find them, but they were also ridiculed in public. So it was like this odd dichotomy. They appreciated them when they were on stage, but then when they were out in public, just living life, that was a problem. So there's a serious contradiction into how they treated the actors while they were performing and entertaining people, and then how they were like walking around normal life. So that's rather bizarre. But it's important to note that this was the reason that they did this is because women were seen as inferior. That's also why, I mean, aside from some other laws that were enacted, but there's no gratuitous sex scenes that happen in Shakespeare. First of all, there was, if you did that type of stuff in public, you'd be arrested because that's considered lewd conduct. That would get you in serious trouble. And then homosexuality was also considered a sin. And punishable by law, oftentimes by death. And so they would make sure that great, that's my husband calling. They would make sure, what Shakespeare would do is there might be a kiss on stage, but there's nothing gratuitous, nothing like you watch movies now that are PG-13 and there's like a whole sex scene. That definitely would not happen. Much more prudish back then in general. So just being aware of that. So it didn't mean like people weren't making out on stage. It didn't matter if it was a dude and a lady or whatever. They just were not doing that on stage. It doesn't matter. Even if a man and a woman were performing on stage, it would be considered inappropriate if they were to do something beyond like a peck on the cheek or something. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to point out is that one of the other reasons that we perform or that we read Shakespeare is because he has I'm literally saying made up and created words that we needed. So some of the words that he created, like assassination, bump, lonely, zany, dawn, leaky, and like those are words that were the first time they were recorded in history in English language was in a Shakespeare play. Um, and believe me, there are people that their entire job is to research words. Wouldn't you love that job? And so, like some phrases, wild goose chase, the concept of love is blind, for goodness sake, dead as a doornail, all of those were first seen in a Shakespeare play. So that's another reason why Shakespeare is considered like important to read because he had such an incredible influence on our language today. So I am going to be done with this presentation. Watch the other one concerning the how Shakespeare writes his text and the influence of that. So, yay!